Oh, hello, hello, come in. Hi, hi, nice to see you again. Oh, I feel almost ashamed at this state. You come upon me just as I'm about, having been away for so long and gone off and done other things, I'm about to begin the big clear up so I can at least find my way around the thing and deal with the awful pile of things on my desk. I've been traveling and just everything accumulates and I haven't done I'm not very good at admin or tidying, but it is going to happen, and today is the day it's going to happen. However, I'm always happy to procrastinate and do something different instead. So let's just take the opportunity of your being here and enjoy some poetry. I can hardly reach this section. It's not really organized, but all along here are the slim volumes of modern poetry. And because I love form, I often read older poetry, and I love the great masters of the sonnet form or the ballad form, or Spenser for his Spenserian stanzas. But of course there are some contemporary poets who, whilst they don't always use form, have nevertheless shown themselves to be masters of it. And one of those, if we can find him here, snuggling between two Ted Hughes books, one of those, I think I may have read you one or two of his pieces before, is Don Paterson, a contemporary Scottish poet who actually published recently a book of 40 sonnets. But what alerted me to him as a master of the sonnet form, apart from his strangely rambling and rambunctious commentary on Shakespeare's sonnets, was this little book here, Orpheus, a version of Rilke. Version is an important word here. So this is a version and not a translation, as he's at pains to point out, of Rilke's famous sonnets to Orpheus. Now, Rilke was holed up in this chateau, sort of in a really intense state, trying to finish his Duino elegies, when suddenly, out of nowhere, this inspiration came. It partly to do with the death of a young girl whom he was a friend of his daughter's, and whose diaries, the girl's mother had sent her diaries of her last days. I think she died of tuberculosis, and she became a kind of Eurydice figure, the one who's snatched away to the underworld, where the archetypal poet Orpheus goes down to find her, and suddenly he became a sort of Orpheus and wanted to write these memorials for her. And in, I think it's about 10 days, he wrote 55 sonnets. Anyway, come and have a seat. So I'm immensely handicapped in my appreciation of Rilke, whom I really like, by not having German, and that's just a serious omission in my education. So I rely on translation, and I've read 3 or 4 different translations done over the last 40 years of Rilke's poetry. And it's always really interesting to see how different translators attempt it. But I've never read anything as good as these Don Paterson sonnets to Orpheus. But Paterson himself, I'll see if I can find this, makes this distinction between what he calls translating and what he calls versioning. He says, this is not a translation, but a version. A translation tries to remain true to the original words and their relations, and its primary aim is usually one of stylistic elegance. It goes on about that. It glosses the original, does not try to replace it. Versions, however, are trying to be poems in their own right. While they have the original to serve as a detailed ground plan and elevation, they are trying to build themselves a robust home in a new country, in its vernacular architecture, with local words for its brick and local music for its mortar. This means that they must have their own course, their own process, and have to make a virtue of their own human mistakes. They will have, in other words, their own pattern of error and lyric felicity. That's fantastic writing. So he's making a new poem. I love this metaphor of the old poem as the sort of ground plan, but he's making, I love the idea of the poem itself as a house or a structure. Of course, he's playing on the fact that the word stanza means little room. Possibly he's alluding to the idea of poetry as making a local habitation and a name for something, because there's that very much sense about the local words for its brick, the local music for its mortar. It's great. Anyway, the results, I think, are spectacular. So I thought I think I may have already read you the one about the unicorn and possibly another one, and I'm not sure, but I thought we could. Now, we just read one or two of them. The other thing that is really extraordinary, by the way, the other nice thing about this is this was actually inscribed to me by the poet himself. So that sort of gives it something else as well. Now, the other thing, I mean, I admire Paterson as a poet and as a craftsman. I disagree with him about a lot of things. He's an atheist, and strictly speaking, a materialist atheist. He's completely convinced of, as it were, a kind of physical causality. In the functioning of our brains, he regards brain and mind as the same thing, and he therefore wants to almost discover a sort of neurobiology of poetry. I think that's perverse, and he's therefore very, very resistant to the language of the spiritual. And he claims, in the teeth of all the evidence and in the teeth of his own virtues, he writes quite a sort of rather hectoring afterword to this, rebuking anybody who calls Rilke a spiritual writer. Well, I mean, you can be the judge of that when you've heard these poems. There's no, to my mind, no question, nor has there ever been, that Rilke is a spiritual writer. But there is a point. The reason why Paterson is so resistant to the language of the spirit or the language of theology or any kind of language of transcendence at all is that he thinks we have never really known or loved or praised or celebrated the sheer factuality of things, the extraordinary business of being here, the immense complexity and beauty of all of this. And he thinks that's where something that we want to call spiritual is to be found, if it's to be found anywhere. And he's really interested in the way Rilke, reflecting on death and the way the knowledge of death coming intensifies life and so on. He thinks Rilke is a great poet of the earth, and he says at one point, that the return of the word earth, the earth is the key poem in the whole sequence. Now, I think, therefore, his resistance to my faith, to my Christian faith, and the Christian faith of the, if you like, the Scottish culture in which he's brought up, is a resistance to a false thing. I think what he's really resisting is dualism or manichaeism, or, and I think if one were really to come to terms with the incarnation and the immanence of God the Spirit and God's love of the matter, the fact that the matter that he created, that matter matters to God, I think a conversation could be had. But I'm probably not the person to have that conversation with him. But nevertheless, I delight in his poetry. So let's start with the poem, which is about 4 or 5 sonnets in, called Praising, which is about the very nature of poetry. Orpheus, of course, is the archetypal poet. I mean, you know the basic story that Eurydice is taken down into the underworld, and Orpheus loves her and goes down to find her, and because of the power of his poetry and his lyre and his song, he's able to make the passage into the underworld, and he's able to plead for her. And it's a poem about death and resurrection, so a myth about death and resurrection. And he leads her up, but he's told he must not look back. He has to absolutely trust that she's following, and then he kind of panics and looks back, and because he looks back, she's not able to come out. And so it's also about longing and yearning and the sense of our failure, and yet he does something that nobody, of course, until the coming of Christ and the harrowing of hell has done. And of course, Christ does it fully. And for me, Orpheus is not only an archetype of the poet, but also a foreshadower of Christ. But anyway, that's not something that Paterson would say. But he is a great poet. So here's a poem just called Praising. I think it's about poetry. I also think, contra Paterson, it's about our spiritual life. Praising, that's it. One appointed to praise. He came like the ore from the stone, its locked silence. His quick heart a tireless press for that wine eternal to man. His voice never dries or fails when the divine grips him to pour from his mouth, and everything turns to vineyard and vine ripe in his aesthetic south. Nothing can prove him untrue when he sings, not the mould on the tombs of kings, nor the god's shadow fall. He is holding deep into the doors of the dead the prizes, the fruit-laden bowls, the herald who stayed. That's just, I think, astonishing. And the pleroma, the fullness, you know, the quick heart, the tireless press for that wine, everything turns to vineyard. It's an astonishing poem. Now, here's a poem, interestingly, which really presses home, or not, Paterson's idea that this is not a spiritual poet, or a poet of spirituality. Perhaps it's just a quarrel with the word spirituality, but here is a poem called The Spirit, capital T, capital S. I can read this unquestionably as a Christian and feel I've been given some words, even if the person who gave me them doesn't share my faith. I think there is another spirit at work, the Spirit. Praise the Spirit that can make us one, for we live our lives in signs and figures. Truly, the false clocks with their little steps march on beside the stream of our authentic day. And though our elements are mystery, we somehow still act out what it marries. Antennae seeking out other antennae as the empty distance carries. Pure tension. O harmony of the powers. Do we keep you free from chaos, somehow bleeded off in all our frantic intercourse? For what? The farmer's fuss and fret? The sower can't reach down to where the fattening seed is turning towards summer. The earth bestows. Oh, it's just astonishing. Just two quick things from that poem that, you know, stayed with me ever since I read it. One is the wonderful difference between the true flow of the stream, of course being not only a stream, but the actual undifferentiated stream of time. A contrast between that and our mechanical chopping it up. This is fantastic. Truly, the false clocks with their little steps march on beside the stream of our authentic day. It's a great image if you're trying to get free from, you know, and into a real spiritual flow and awareness, to think of all your clocks and calendars as making these tiny little steps beside the stream. But you should be in the stream itself. And I think that's partly why something inside me always wants to float, always wants to be on rivers, or at least to stand above rivers, or to be beside rivers, because I perceive time as flow, and I perceive a freedom inside the flow. And because, of course, when you're floating on a moving stream, you're, in one sense, no, because you're moving at the same pace of the stream, it's still, you actually have a combination of movement and stillness. The earth bestows, though, the last bit. So the sower sows, but the earth bestows. Where it said, you know, we drop the seeds, we do these things. And I think this is true of poetry as well. You know, you do what you can, you dig your little bit down. But what you can't do is reach down to this deep, earthy womb of creativity where the fattening seed is turning towards summer. Only the earth bestows. And that, to me, is a moment of praise or worship. It's a moment that says, something is happening here, which is not me, and which comes to me as beauty and pleroma and gift. And so that's I think a really, really, really beautiful thing. Let me just give you one last one, which again perhaps turns on what we mean by spirit or the spiritual. You'll know that the word for spirit in the New Testament, pneuma, is also the word for breath. And you can see that the breathing, the thing which is outside us and yet comes in us, nourishes us, we give it back, it returns to us. It is upon the words and the breath that the spirit is born. There's a whole theology of spirit and word, which is to do with the words born on the breath of the spirit. And without that breath, we don't speak at all. And the fact that we all breathe one atmosphere. Anyway, this poem is just called Breath, as opposed to the one that was called The Spirit. But again, it speaks to me both at a profound, theological level, but it also speaks to me about this thing that we're doing now, being together and talking and letting words float across and back and forth. So this is the first poem in the second part of the sonnets to Orpheus. Breath. Breath, you invisible poem, pure exchange, sister to silence, being and its counterbalance, rhythm wherein I become, ocean I accumulate by stealth, by the same slow wave, thriftiest of seas, thief of the whole cosmos. What is states? What vast spaces have already poured through my lungs? The four winds are like daughters to me. So do you know me, air that once sailed through me? You that were once the leaf and rind of my every word. Oh, it's fantastic when he addresses the air. It says, do you know me, you that... And the sense that the air we're breathing is being breathed all over the place. It's what vast estates. You imagine these kind of winds over kind of fields of shimmering wheat blowing, and then eventually they fill your lungs and they bring with you everything that they've ever blown over, and then you turn it to words and your words sail back out, and there's this, as he says, pure exchange. In fact, the poem really starts with a series of poetic emblems. It's very like, I don't suppose Rilke would have known it, but it's very like George Herbert's poem Prayer, where he has a whole series of prayer, the church's banquet, angel's age, God's breath in man, returning to his birth, soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage. So breath, what is breath? Here's the list of things. Invisible poem, pure exchange, sister to silence, being and its counterbalance, rhythm wherein I become. Oh, that's so good. Being and its counterbalance. I am because I'm able to breathe, but the counterbalance is that I must let go and breathe out. There's a counterbalance between life and death. And of course, anybody that's practiced any form of spirituality or prayer knows the importance of breathing, and knows that what happens is a breathing in rhythm. Rhythm wherein I become. And then wonderful, ocean I accumulate by stealth. Oh, it's astonishing. So Pache, Don Paterson's strangely kind of reductive or immanent frame attempt to read these poems, I think they work precisely because they operate simultaneously in two realms which are nevertheless married to each other. In fact, there's another fabulous poem in here called The Double Realm, which talks about, in a sense, earth and heaven dwelling together, and has a beautiful and important place for earth. There's a wonderful phrase in that. They're talking about the poet, talking about, does he belong here? No, his spacious nature had its birth in both realms. Who has dwelt among the willow's roots will weave the osier so much more deftly in the upper light. Isn't that fantastic? All the things we do up here in the light have then roots and nurturing, and we have to dwell in those roots and nurturing where the seed fattens towards summer. Anyway, there you are, a little taste of Don Paterson's version of Rilke that he just calls Orpheus. It's one of the best slim volumes of modern poetry ever, I think. Anyway, cheers, and thanks for dropping by.